Welcome to the Bike Hearing Podcast. I am Eric.
And I am Aisla, and I'm very excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler.
Hi.
Hello, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, why don't you start? You can give us a little bit of background on yourself. I was very pleased to meet you a couple of weeks ago, and I know Isla has been working with you more closely on different things, but please tell everybody a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm one of those people that has spent her whole career in human resources. And about a year and a half ago, right about the time of the election, I started to see something that really made me very sad. And not just sad because it was bad, sad because we've been here before in history, and that was watching our country polarize, particularly around race. And because I grew up in the civil rights movement in the segregated South, it really was difficult for me a year and a half ago to watch us gravitate back to a place that I think we'd already been. And it became the catalyst for me starting a company that I now run called the Equity Project. I'm the chief catalyst and founder of that company, and its goal and objective is to travel our country, working with organizations and systems and communities across all sectors, helping them to create their strategic plans and understand more deeply what the word equity really means.
And I have to say, having worked with Nita, it's how I met her many years ago. She is incredibly skilled at helping people to connect and to feel more included. So I think it's a great gift that you are bringing to the people that you work with. So I'm excited to hear that you're doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds like a fantastic project, and you used a word that I think is a large part of the motivation we had for even starting this podcast, which was polarized. The world is polarized in a lot of ways right now, and that's where I think some of the best work I see being done is about changing the outlook on that. And we all have our missions and stuff, but yours sounds fascinating.
Well, thanks for that. I really believe we've got to shift how we are having these traditional conversations about diversity and inclusion and equality and equity. And we have to create ways to have these conversations that actually invite people in versus isolate people. We've done a lot of isolation work, whether intentionally or not, over the years. And my philosophy is the more that we can invite all of us into the conversation, so that we can see ourselves in these words, then I think we increase the capability to even get to systems of equity. I mean, I don't know how you have people advancing equity if they don't even see themselves in the definition of diversity.
Thank you for saying that. And I could not agree more. That is very much my philosophy. I feel like in general, society right now involves a lot of people slicing themselves out of things and isolating themselves and trying to isolate other people. Isla and I were talking earlier about the othering of people and how sometimes trying to avoid othering people is what others them. And it's a very strange world right now because I don't think people really understand the idea of diversity is actually about inclusion, not isolation.
Yeah. So I always tell this story, if I can just tell you real quickly.
Oh, please.
Um, I feel like I'm old enough now to know where I think the moment in time happened when we really went sideways on all of this. And I believe it was the 1980s. And if you will remember, and I know a lot of your listeners weren't even born, but in the 1980s, all kinds of things were happening that we'd never faced before. The crack cocaine epidemic, the HIV and AIDS epidemic. More women were coming into the workplace. More people of color were coming into the workplace. Reaganomics, all those things were happening. And I have to be honest with you, and I was a diversity trainer back then, organizations and systems had no idea what to do with all of that diversity happening at once. And so we created this really strange way of trying to describe why we needed to get on board with all of this diversity. We wanted people to embrace it and value it and all of that. But we really didn't have a good case for why it needed to happen because at that time, everything was mandatory, including diversity training. And so I always share that to me, the two great travesties happened in the 1980s. And the first one is the travesty of what we did to white people in diversity training in the 1980s. The second one is the travesty of what we did to people of color in diversity training in the 1980s. The travesty of what we did to white people is when we described the word diversity in those diversity trainings, we described it as everything that wasn't white. And we were explicit about it. We meant it, and we wanted to be sure that white people understood that diversity was everything that wasn't them. And for people of color, we told people of color that diversity was them. And as a matter of fact, we weren't even talking about ethnicity back then. We were only talking about race. It was a black and white conversation. And then we went on to describe people of color in terms of their oppressions, not talking about the entire lived experience, contributions, inventions, and all of that of people of color. So those were two great travesties that have us situated the way that we are in 2018, still trying to have this conversation about diversity.
Thank you. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's actually kind of a take on things that I hadn't really ever thought about, but it makes total sense. And I think I remember those times because I do remember the '80s, and when yeah, it was black and white issues. There wasn't a lot of really digging into people as a person, like what their real background was. I was actually I was thinking about this the other day. An old friend of mine who would tolerate being called an African American, even though she was from Trinidad and she was half African, half Indian. And so, in a lot of regards, like she's
Mhm.
happy that she could get called something that at least made sense and wasn't offensive and didn't describe her at all.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't go very deep. I think at that time we simply were trying to convince people that diversity was good without having to go deep in the conversations or acknowledge that diversity was broader than race.
Right.
Hmm.
Well, and it's that baby steps and people you start where you are. It was such a shift that at the time, I mean, I would guess that felt like a big step. And then now we can, with hindsight, look back and realize the things that were missed. In the same way that, I watch old TV shows that I was like, "Oh, this is so culturally aware." And I watch it and I cringe. I'm like, "Wow, they literally probably didn't have anyone who knew anything about that culture
Yeah.
writing that character.
Yeah.
Ouch." But at the
Ouch.
time, I was like, "Yay, there's someone
Yeah,
from a
that's
different
exactly
culture."
right.
And now I'm like, "Oh, no. No, I will not show this show to my children. They will mock me for good reason."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I can see how, I mean, it is something I've noticed is that we define people, and especially people of color, by what they have lost, what they don't have, how they are limited. We don't talk about the innovations that were created by people of color, the inventions, like that history is missing. And instead, and I think there's some shift, I don't know, you have more experience that towards trying to celebrate that more, and yet that invisibility is problematic at
Well,
best.
this actually begs a question that I want to ask now, because that is a fascinating thing you pointed out about how we got here in the '80s. So, how do you feel that we're changing, and or in what ways do you want to see that change?
So I think we've changed a lot because we've expanded what the word diversity means. I think what we have not done a good job of, however, is including white people in the definition of diversity. I still don't know that we've made that shift. Now, this is a black woman saying this to you. When you hear the word diversity, still, if you just closed your eyes and told the truth about it, our minds immediately go to race when we hear the word diversity. I think when white people hear the word diversity, it takes you to race and not yours.
Mhm.
I think when people of color hear the word diversity, we hear ourselves in that definition. So we still are operating in the remnants of the way the 80s rolled out the definition of diversity. I'm not sure that we've moved much in that area. And I feel really strongly that whether you're talking about white privilege or white supremacy or any of the implicit biases that we need to adjust and shape and grow out of, you cannot get that accomplished if white people can't see themselves in the definition of diversity. You can't advance any of those because you're always in a position of talking about other people.
That that makes a ton of sense, and I think you're spot on that as long as it's not a group effort, it can't move forward. We're not gonna be successful if we don't all feel like we're all involved.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And it's interesting because I am a white male and I just turned 40, and I've had my experiences, and in a lot of ways I do know exactly what you're talking about, that, I am literally the representation of non-diverse by a
Mhm.
lot of standards. And I mean, I think a motivating factor for me, like why I enjoy social justice work, is an opportunity just to participate in actually helping people to overcome some of my own guilt, I guess, just for the way that I happen to have been born.
Mhm.
But, yeah, it's kind of an interesting world because there's a lot of othering going on, and right now it does feel like white male is an other.
Yeah. I was in a conversation the other day about what happens when we start to, even if it's justified in its concepts, white males have been at the top of the food chain on white supremacy and sexism and all kinds of things, and we know the history. But in the process of trying to heal those things and learn about those things and reconcile those things, if we also in that process villainize people where we create groups on the fringe, then we're just duplicating history. So again, we're not inviting people in. I want white men to be in the definition of diversity because they are. And there's a special story that white men need to tell, just like there's a special story that black and brown men need to tell. And if we don't make space for that to happen, I worry about our ability to not only get to systems of equity, but to even get to inclusion. So I do think we still are operating, trying to figure it out in the category of diversity.
Yeah, and
So I was also talking to Iceland, and I've not had a chance to read it yet, but you wrote a book.
Yeah.
Maybe
In
you
my
can talk a
spare
little bit about.
in your spare time, you have no spare time. What are you talking about?
But the title alone kind of fascinated me.
Yeah. I wrote a book. I have really been very aware of my stories from my childhood. I just have so much clarity about how I grew up right now. I think the older you get, the more you recall your youth. And I decided I wanted to pull together 30 stories of my childhood that actually taught me a lot of what I know about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the name of the book is White People Really Love Salad.
Which is entertaining, just even conceptually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it true though? Do you think it's true?
See, I'm kind of a fitness buff, and I do eat a lot of salad
Uh huh.
as an
See,
entree.
you see, I was right.
I eat salad when I have to,
Yeah.
if other people make it. I've been really trying to teach myself to like vegetables. My preference is sugar and fat.
Yeah.
So, but I tried to retell some aspect of the story, the title story, to Eric, because I was so affected by it. I don't know if you'd be willing to tell it, or if there's another story you think is better from or more engaging or whatever. But
Yeah, I'd love to tell you the story. So, the title of the book, White People Really Love Salad, is actually one of the stories in the book. And the story is about the first time I ever had dinner at a white family's house. My family had just integrated an all white neighborhood. The white neighbors were not happy to see us there. A house had been vandalized. It was really a nasty time. There was no welcome wagon there for sure. But one of my classmates invited me over for dinner. And so this was a white family. So I went over for dinner and it was great. And we got seated at the table and there was this gigantic salad bowl at the table. And I thought, hmm, first of all, it was the biggest bowl of salad I'd ever seen. And I thought, well, white people really love salad. And then the mother went to serve each of us. And she put these big, gigantic piles of salad on the plates. Well, I put my own salad on my plate and I just put a little bit because I was making room for the entree, only to find out that there was no entree. That was the entree. And so then I really thought white people really love salad. So I left their house. I got home. My parents said, "How was dinner?" And I said, "It was horrible." And they said, "Why was it horrible?" And I said, "They didn't have any food." And my mom said, "Well, what do you mean they didn't have any food? What'd you have for dinner?" And I said, "Salad. They're poor. They don't have any food." And my parents were horrified. Like, how did these white people live in this neighborhood and they had no food? So my father said, "Well, we've got to help them." And my mother said, "As mean as these people have been to us, you want to help them?" And my father said, "Absolutely. We got to help them because they're probably embarrassed that they're poor living in this neighborhood." So my mother set out to cook this gigantic dinner that we then delivered to this family the next day. My father said, "Don't let on that we know they're poor. Let's tell them that this is the reverse welcome wagon. This is where the new neighbors take something to the old neighbors." And so off we go with, like, in essence, what was Thanksgiving to this family. And they were so excited and they had no idea we were bringing them this food because I went home and told the family they were poor. So, the moral of the story, this is what happens after every story in my book. What did that represent? It represents how quickly we can generalize and stereotype people and everything that comes after that, like actions happen after that, because we don't understand cultural norms. And so I went from salad to poverty to we've got to help them to a belief system that something was wrong because I didn't have any familiarity with what white people might be eating for dinner. Salad was not on the menu in our Black family. Not only was it not the entree, it wasn't even the side dish. So that's one of my favorite stories in the book. I learned a lot from that time.
I I love that story, and part of it is I think I fell in love with your dad. That this because I you shared some, and I have some minimal comprehension of what your parents must have been going through to move into that neighborhood, and the kind of hatred they likely faced, and yet his heart was so big that he had to start with, well, we gotta step in and help them out. And
Mhm.
that it just it's so beautiful and inspiring to me. Like, if more people were your dad, the world would be a better
Yeah, I was
place.
just gonna say that that would solve a lot of problems, your dad aside, if people just could do that.
Yeah, I believe that. Sometimes people laugh at me when I say this, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I really feel strongly that one of the things that's missing in this work that is social justice work, advancing equity, advancing inclusion, requires a few words that we don't say out loud a lot, and that is love and grace. I don't think you can advance equity, chipping away at disparities and inequities and injustices, if you don't have love and grace in your spirit, in your body, in your soul. You have to have that. And I appreciate you saying that about my dad. I didn't know what to call what my dad was. I thought he was crazy back then. But But today I know that was love and grace.
Yeah.
Yeah, I I I like to be an optimist in this way, and I'm not always. Sometimes I am a cynic. I think most people are capable of that. I think it's just easy to forget how to do it. And
Hmm.
sometimes you need to hear a story like that to understand, oh, that's what that's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
That's what actually being helpful and a meaningful, member of your community can actually look like. One of the themes, in all of the work that we've been doing that keeps coming up for us is realizing that if communities actually kind of paid attention to people, and this came up when we did a podcast subject on suicide, um, several other ones, but and they all have one thing in common is that if the community is actually involved and paying attention to things, it's probably the best way to solve most problems, not legislation at the federal level, not, electing, even city council members, but just people actually paying attention to the people around them and how
Hmm.
we can actually make a difference and an impact, you know. Passing laws making suicide illegal certainly wouldn't change much of what happens, but people noticing if their friend seems down and offering to support them could change so much dramatically for that person.
Yeah.
And the same goes, I think, with diversity. And like you were saying, how out of curiosity, the Paul Harvey on that, the rest of the story, how did it go integrating into that, neighborhood, and did that family become friends of yours? And
Yeah, it took a while for us to become friends. I think we just didn't know enough about each other for the white family. They'd never been in that proximity to Black people, and vice versa. So I think it just took some cultural maneuvering to find the common threads between us. I would say to you that probably took about 6 months for that to happen. And then eventually it became a little more palatable with the rest of the neighbors. And then, quite frankly, there were some neighbors that just never accepted us and left the neighborhood.
yeah, I guess I'm not all that surprised by that, but it does have at least somewhat of a happy ending.
Yeah.
And being able to connect with some people. And I think that's another thing that I've noticed too. You can change some minds, and sometimes you're not going to change everyone's mind. I think in the end, if you can be a good person, if you can, be, I love the term killing people with kindness. It's a tactic that I have found works for a lot of situations. So, in some ways, at least you never have to look back on those situations and say that you didn't do everything you could to be nice.
Right. Yeah. And I think it is quite possible to be direct, tell the truth, and still have love and grace. I think we've separated those things. And so I talk every day about needing to eradicate racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And I can be very direct with that with love and grace. I actually don't think we have to beat up on each other to talk about these things. And I actually don't think we need to poke at each other to work collaboratively to solve these things. So I think our methods for doing this work have to evolve. And that's a part of the commitment I have in doing this work.
I I really agree that one of the things I was looking at an article in the Wall Street Journal or an opinion piece that was talking about liberal racism, and uh, in talking to Eric about it, one of the things that I came to is that the the approach that we have right now in the liberal community incites more competition than compassion. So
Hmm.
people feel like they need to compete over how their ism is a bigger, burden in order to be legitimized in some way. And what you're talking about, that inviting in, the way that I was referred to it is more this compassion approach of, I see you and I see what you're struggling with, and I'll acknowledge that. And can you also acknowledge these other things, not in a competition place, but in a compassion and a connection place? Then how can we work together so everybody can move forward?
Yeah, I agree with you too. Even in activism, we're doing the same thing in activism. We're competing on even who's the best activist or who's the loudest activist or what topic around activism is the most important. So we're slicing and dicing on all social justice areas, and it is not accomplishing creating a system of equity.
It really isn't.
No, it's not. So we have work to do there. I mean, the equation that I think we've used up to this point has given us some small wins on some fronts. And then in many ways, there's some things that I think we've gone backwards in. And I want to get us to the table to talk about what we do in a collective way that advances equity, in a way that everyone benefits and all boats rise.
Here, here.
Mhm.
So, let's hear. So, what are some of the things you're working on, like right now? I'm just curious to hear. Like, this sounds fantastic, and I'd like to know more of the details.
Yeah, well, I'm speaking all over the country now. I thought I was going to be doing work just in Colorado, Colorado that I love, and I've ended up now traveling the country, working with all kinds of organizations to talk about this new framework for maybe advancing equity. I've got a lot of work to do to promote my book. I've been pretty quiet about it because it's relatively new. So I've been setting strategies for how to promote the book. I started another company in my spare time a couple of months ago. It's called the HR Shop. The HR Shop is an HR consulting firm that's designed for nonprofits and small businesses because they normally don't have HR support. So we're the HR department for them. And so all of those things are happening right now. It's been pretty cool.
That's fantastic. Yeah. It's actually good to hear because I mean, I did mention I feel like community is where it all starts, but if your message is getting out nationally, then congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you.
They're
Thank you.
lucky to have you.
Thank you. Well, ditto. I feel really privileged to be able to work with so many organizations and systems around this topic. Everybody's in a different place, but it's it really is encouraging. Talk about hope. It's encouraging to see the number of folks that want to have this conversation, might not know how to have it, and really want to explore what they're already doing.
I agree with you. I do feel like we're in a bit of transition in the world right now where people are starting to notice the different ways that they want to talk about things and getting over that embarrassment. I mean, I admit there's been times in my life on sensitive subjects like I just didn't talk about it at all because I didn't know where to start. And people are starting to get to a point of like, okay, how do we actually address this? What actually works for people? I
Mhm.
think that the number one thing that we are up against right now is that even if people's hearts are in a good place, they don't necessarily have any idea of how to implement that in a positive way. And
Right.
that can almost be as damaging to any marginalized people or any group of people at all, to implement something poorly or in a way that doesn't actually benefit anyone.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a lot of fear out there, and some of it is grounded in real experiences, and some of it is grounded in perceived danger. We've got both of those going on in the world. And so, all that we can do to try to reconcile and heal that is, I think, critical work.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Nita. I really appreciate you being on the show and giving us your time and your story.
And if you'd like, we would love to have you back on as we find other topics and have your expertise on. You definitely bring something that we do not have, which is your unique perspective.
Agreed.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for lifting up such an important topic. It's for all of us. I hope that it can ignite the power of all of us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And welcome to this week's Bi-Curian Moment. You go first.
Okay. Mine is the InfoWars moment in history.
Yeah. Imagine that. Somebody said something controversial and then got banned for saying it off of various different things. That's a violation of free speech, right?
Well, interestingly, no.
See, this is what I think the main problem with the idea of free speech is. is you have the freedom to not be arrested for what you say or to have a message and say it. You are not guaranteed a platform.
Right. And I do feel like that's what has happened is that we've conflated I have the right to say what I want to say with I have the right to have it amplified by the platform of my choice.
Right. Or access to certain things. You know, we have a podcast and we're on a lot of various different services. And I would imagine that if we engaged in hate speech, we'd probably get yanked down too.
That would be great.
Feels
I think if we're engaging in hate speech, we should be yanked down.
right. And that's, these are private entities, they're businesses. Apple, iTunes, that's a business.
It's not the government.
Facebook's a business.
The government can't
They're
is
not
not
required
yeah.
to give anybody a platform.
And the government is required to not punish people for saying things. I can say things that I want to about the military or the president or my elected representatives or the state of the country as a whole. And those things can be offensive or inflammatory. And that's all allowed. Nobody can come arrest me for that. That's free speech.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of interesting because I do have a bias on it. I don't like the InfoWars guy
Well,
or his show.
it
or
was
his
interesting to
message.
me because when he first started going on about the free speech thing, I was like, where do I land with this? And I also, one of the things that I noted when I was reading up on it is, yeah, these people are applying a policy around hate speech to this particular entity, and they have applied it to other entities, including LGBTQ entities that I have followed and thought were interesting. And so it's not that they're even applying their policy unevenly, which could be seen as a discriminatory act. So that's not a free speech issue. It could be a discrimination issue, except they actually apply the policy to other entities. They're simply also applying it to this guy now.
Right. The only problem with Jones is that he's kind of the deep state guy. And I mean, his entire show is basically conspiracy theories. He's actually got a conspiracy against him that he doesn't have to theorize about right now because certain entities that he has run his show through are saying you pushed it too far. You can't do that on our platform. Our listeners who have listened to every podcast may be aware of this. I'm not a big fan of Facebook. I feel like it's a necessary evil, but not my favorite thing in the world because of what it has become. But I think this is a good step for them in becoming a responsible entity.
A responsible media entity.
Well, exactly. Because
we call it social media.
Nobody had ever thought of them as the media before.
Well, no, we didn't get, and they were. And
right. They're absolutely where people get their news, and they need to start treating some of what passes through them like news articles, or at least acknowledging that certain people are going to read that and take it very seriously.
Well, I put this up on the Facebook page, Facebook, and asked a question, and one of the people who responded said that the challenge is that Facebook is social media. It's a form of media. And back in the day, we all knew the National Enquirer was the National Enquirer.
Right.
If I picked it up, because as a guilty pleasure, I would read about how we were going to dig a pipeline to the moon to save prices on gas. I mean, how can you not buy that? However, I understood what I was reading was not actually legitimate news.
Right. Tabloids that carried a weight when you said, oh, it's a tabloid. What does that mean? It means it's probably BS.
It could be fun or funny or horrifying. However, most of us knew what we were reading.
Right.
And the problem with Facebook and Twitter to a certain extent was that it became a media source without anyone actually vetting, not just Facebook as an entity, but the users, each of us, myself, vetting what we were receiving as news.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. My Bikerian moment also involves the media to an extent. A couple of weeks ago, there was an article in The Atlantic, and I had kind of read it at the time. And the idea, the title of it was How Trump Radicalized ICE, which is, in fact, something that I guess I hadn't really thought about. So I did some digging over the last couple of weeks. And what I have actually really kind of come to learn is ICE is sort of fighting a very disturbing battle behind the scenes right now.
You were telling me some of it, and it
Yeah,
is
there's like more than a few people who have come forward, and in this article it's outlined, have stated things like how ICE is in general, like, they're investigating people that were immigrants but like are citizens now. We're not even talking green card. We're talking they've got a driver's license and they raised their hand and swore their allegiance to this country. And they're getting harassed to provide more documentation of that.
is that even legal? It seems to me like that shouldn't even be legal.
So, and that's where you really get into it. And of course, we can always bash Trump if we wanted to for a lot of different things, but realistically, it's actually a couple of other players in the government that are kind of pushing this idea that you can investigate and work people over enough that maybe they'll leave. And it's targeting, like, you know, Americans, not they're citizens. They're no longer illegal immigrants. They're not legal immigrants. They're citizens. And it's causing a movement of like to chase out a lot of these immigrants just by making them feel uncomfortable and scared. And it was really scary to me.
That is a lot upsetting.
Yeah. In the show notes, we'll post a link to the article so that you can go back and read it if you're interested. But just interesting to know that, you know, not everything that you think is bad in the news even makes the news. That, you know, like that I didn't, you know, that's not something that was making front page news until this article that I read, and then I dug in and realized it's kind of really scary. And it, in a lot of ways, it's not as glamorous as covering separating families at the border and all of the other things that have been going on, but it's a real problem. And I mean, I would be worried about any rogue entity in our government, um, police, you know, firemen, whoever, ICE agents operating under that sort of mandate. It's kind of terrifying. So this is more of a public service announcement to our listeners to pay attention. Some things can slip through and be a lot scarier than we even realize.
Thanks for bringing it to our attention. And thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media by Curian on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or give us a call at 720-507-7309. It's just a voicemail line. You don't have to talk to anyone. Or email podcast@bycurian.com.
Thanks, and we'll talk to you next time.